We have thus seen how Hegel, in Part 1 and Part 2 of the Phenomenology's final chapter, has remedied the defect of revealed religion and its double alienation with regard to the object that is the world and the object that is God, which has resulted in absolute knowing and the absolute concept. Lastly, after Hegel briefly summarizes the historical process that produced absolute knowing, starting with the primitive Christian community, through the medieval and into the modern period, beginning with Descartes and ending with Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel himself. After this summary, Hegel gives a brief sketch of absolute science and the sciences of logic, nature, and spirit, and ends the Phenomenology with that famous quote from Schiller's poem, quote, "Only from the chalice of this realm of spirits foams forth to God his infinity," end quote. In the fall 2019, I will be taking up Hegel's Science of Logic, which will conclude our study of Hegel's system of absolute science. As for the question of the difference between the phenomenology and the science of logic, in brief, and as Hegel says, quote, "Spirit, having won the concept, absolute knowledge, displays its existence and movement in this ether of its life and is science, notably logic. In logic, the moments of spirit's movement no longer show themselves as specific shapes of consciousness, but since consciousness's difference from its object has returned into the self as specific concepts and as their organic, self-grounded movement," end quote. That is, the essential content and movement of the phenomenology and the logic are the same. However, the logic studies the concept and its development in pure thought alone as freed from the appearance in consciousness and from its association with picture thinking and its historical contents, e.g. master-slave, the Roman world, money and politics, the French Revolution, art, etc. I will close with a brief summary of absolute science, the science of the absolutes, beings, the universe's knowledge of itself. As we saw, the phenomenology, the introduction to science, ended with the absolute concept, with the collapse of the opposition, the difference between consciousness and its object, between knowing and the truth. We now have a single knowing, consciousness, concept, which is totally absolved from relation to another. A concept, thought or thinking, that is all reality. As Hegel says, quote, "The concept is true being, and being is the concept," end quote. Nothing but the concept exists. We are now ready to do absolute science, the science of the absolute, which is a self-contained circle and begins with the science of logic, which Hegel says, quote, presents God as he is in his eternal essence prior to the creation of nature and finite spirit, or man, end quote. The circle is logic, nature, spirit, and back to logic again. In brief, we begin with logic, with the concept or thought as all reality and the only reality. As Aristotle and Hegel say, with, quote, noesis noesios, the thought of thought, also called the idea in honor of Plato. Logic is the concept or idea in itself and as abstract, not yet realized or for itself. It is the realm of pure thought, the inner, the subjective. Here, beginning with pure being, we trace the development of categories and thought determinations into the absolute idea. Then, immediately, and because of polarity, you can't have one without the other, or all determination is negation, we have thoughts opposite: nature, matter, extension, the outer idea, objectivity. And because nature, parts outside parts, contradicts the unity of logic and thought, nature gradually sets itself aside and returns to unity as spirit, which is the unity of logic and nature, inner and outer, thought and matter. Spirit begins with the soul, and we watch it develop into absolute spirit, ending in art, religion, and philosophical science, that is, logic. This is the circle of science. We start with logic, the truth, spirit, the idea in itself, unactualized, advance to nature, the truth outside of itself, and then to spirit, the truth, spirit, idea, fully actualized as the, quote, self-knowing truth, end quote, which happens in logic. We have returned to the beginning. The circle of science is now complete. As Hegel says at the end of The Science of Logic, quote, after the logic, the idea releases itself as nature. It thereby only posits for itself the mediation out of which the concept ascends as a free existence that completes its self-liberation in the science of spirit and finds the supreme concept of itself in the science of logic as the self-comprehending pure concept, end quote. I cannot end without mentioning again the disease, I can find no better word for it, afflicting the Hegel community, that is, those so-called realist Hegelians who have yet to exit Plato's cave and who hold that it is Hegel's view that nature, matter, sense individuals have true, self-subsistent, independent being in and for themselves apart from spirit. This is clearly contradicted by Hegel in 14 places. For example, quote, the being of nature is essentially ideality. As only relative, nature is related to a first, end quote. Quote, spirit is the truth of nature. Nature in its own self sublates itself as what is untrue, end quote. Quote, spirit is the universal immateriality of nature and matter, end quote. Finally, from the Phenomenology, Hegel says that even the animals are not as stupid as these realist metaphysicians who give absolute reality to sensuous things and sense objects. Indeed, quote, all nature, like the animals, celebrates these open mysteries which teach the truth about sensuous things, end quote. See you in the fall, when we'll take up Hegel's Science of Logic, God before creation. Thank you.